Outstanding. So welcome to everybody who's here with us. I have the honor and the privilege to spend a fair amount of time with you, Ron, right? Working on
We do.
projects.
We do. It's mutually
And
enjoyable.
yeah, most of the time. And the rest of the time, it's only on me. So just to give some background, Ron is going to introduce himself shortly. But right now, he heads a firm called 2468 Appreciate that does a lot of work in fundraising and management consulting, but with a focus on engagement. Um, Prior to that, he was VP at Susquehanna and had a long and distinguished career in fundraising as a frontline fundraiser and leader of teams himself. So, Ron, welcome. It's great to have you on DPP Office Hours. If you could please introduce yourself and kind of give us an overview, other than the morbidity, please, of piece of what we're going to be talking about, that would be great.
Well, thank you. And I don't know that in the interest of time, I'd want to do a whole lot more, but yes, my business, 2468 Appreciate, like the old cheer, is aimed at trying to help organizations think about the broader notion of appreciating their constituents and their stakeholders in ways that then lead to greater engagement, greater giving. And we work with clients all over the country, a lot in higher ed, some in the arts. And it's been fun to partner with you for a while now, back in my former home state of Pennsylvania. So thanks for having me.
Lovely, wonderful. So thanks so much, Ron. We've been doing, if I may say so, some work that I find to be very interesting and profoundly important. Um, and it's, what is this work about? I'd love for you to characterize it.
So um, I think what we've started to hit upon and what we'll show people this morning is that we can make some, can I call them correlated predictions about how engagement can lead to, and here's where I really appreciate you titling this, putting a dollar amount on engagement. Because when I read it, I thought, oh, this is good because those $3 don't necessarily limit us to fundraising. We can talk about value in ways that include fundraising dollars, but actually extend beyond fundraising dollars into revenue, into positive advocacy, and generally things that accrue value and build trust for organizations. And I think ultimately, that's the goal of engagement. And so, yeah, and one of the things, you and I haven't talked about this yet, but as we've worked in particular on a couple of projects, I've thought more about engagement as kind of less the tactics of it and more the outcome of it. And I've, tripped back over the great Maya Angelou quote that is, I've learned that people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And ultimately, I think you and I both believe that how people come to feel about organizations is what drives them to be active participants and supporters in whatever ways align with their capacity. So
I love this, Ron.
And then, the other thing I wanted to mention, because I thought you and Mike Dirksen did such a nice job talking about it last week on your other program on the Luis Diaz channel. But talking about the McKinsey study, the trust, and the elements that are kind of formulaic in laying out that credibility plus reliability plus intimacy divided by an organization's self-orientation produces a really interesting, I can't call it a metric. I mean, there's not a number necessarily that comes into play, but conceptually that those three notions of positive attributes and kind of it's not necessarily negative, but it's almost a holdback. It's something that's limiting, and I think that's an apt sort of filter to have over this conversation today as well.
I love this. So I think you're right. A lot of the conversation around engagement has been very tactical, at least in my experience in our sector. You know, we think of engagement and immediately people start talking about email open rates or event attendance. Whereas I love that the work you're doing and that I'm, privileged to tag along with is we're really elevating the role of engagement, whatever you call it, right? Trust building, etc., as more of a strategic consideration. And in order to do so, you at some point you actually have to say this is making an impact in our bottom line, in our ultimate goal. And it does help because you mentioned too, there are lots of positive effects of engagement that maybe go beyond advancement or development.
Exactly.
So it does help to elevate that at kind of the institutional level, the president, the board.
And again, driving at that place of how do people outside the organization think about you? How do they relate to you? How do they talk about you? And the more they talk about you and the more they do it in ways that are genuine, and the more they feel like they're heard in conversations where your organization's name comes up, that's beneficial. And so, what you and I think have been working on and struggling through and asking questions about and going back to the drawing board on is, how do we lift that up in ways that maybe start to make it more clear and a kind of more obvious investment path to consider.
Okay, so you and I put forward the thesis of today's interview in a one-liner, which I'm going to read back to you, see if you still agree with it, which is essentially that the more people are talking about you in positive ways, the more good things will come your way. Still agree with yourself?
I'm with you. Yep.
Oh, lovely. So, you want to, there's lots of ways to make a case for something. And I'm going to speak for all the engagement professionals that were with us on LinkedIn and now hopefully on YouTube. It's a hard case to make. It's always easier to say, let's increase our ask ratio, or let's increase our visits, our gift officer visits. That seems to conceptually it's easier. How are we going about making this case for engagement? And today we're going to approach it from a couple of angles, right? We're going to start with maybe a story to illustrate it. And then we're going to move into the data.
Yeah. So what, I think you and I are finding helpful is to think about how engagement can help us underscore who we are, what our organization is, even, kind of more important than how it can drive activity and revenue. And so if you'll permit me to jump in with the story, yes. I will. So I have a longtime colleague and friend who is the advancement vice president at a small college in southern Indiana called Wabash College. And she and I were talking several months ago, and she shared that they've started a program. I think they've probably had it in effect for a couple of years now, where, so let's, set the scene. All men's college, all men graduates, and interesting that Michelle is the VP there, first ever female VP, and she's just killing it there. Um, and so if you think about these men who, go on to live lives that Wabash has prepared them to live, many of whom marry, and many of whom marry women. And, the kind of arc of those relationships is that the men, the husbands tend to die before the wives in those relationships. And so Michelle and her team determined that a right thing to do for Wabash was to consider that with the passing of each Wabash man, there was an opportunity to lift that person up in a way that just felt right for the college, and then could extend in a meaningful way the value of that man to a family member. In many cases, the spouse. And so what happens is a little research process. Obviously, the college has lots of information about the people who went there and graduated, but they try to go a step further and understand the values and the causes and the interests of the now deceased, and kind of come up with a rationale for what they then do in going to their library and identifying a book that appears to be a good match with the life that this man led. And into the book goes a book plate memorializing that Wabash alum. And Michelle and her team take a picture of the plate and of the book, and they send it to a family member, again, typically the spouse, and she sends a note that says, "We've lost a good man. We think, given what we know about him, that you would appreciate that we have created this memorial in the form of a book plate in this book. And I'd love to invite you to come see it. And because I would want to do that and create that opportunity for you." So, there's no expectation of a gift. There's no expectation really of anything other than, this is what our institution is. This is how we remember our family members. And we want to do this for you. And what Michelle has shared with me is that almost every one of those communications that she sends is returned, not returned mail returned, but the recipient reaches back out with very heartfelt thanks. And many of them do come to visit. And of course, Michelle takes the person to the library, and they talk and they get to know each other. And it is, I think, a beautiful way of extending, what maybe lots of institutions would consider a relationship that's done, right? Somebody dies. But here is a place that I think is showing that it cares in a way that's different. And how it produces benefit has lots of potential spurs.
Yes. Okay. So let's parse a little bit for this slow Joe in Pennsylvania here, sitting with his books, which is, memorial gifts are typically not the most fertile ground for fundraising, right? And many development teams would consider this kind of a dead end. And that's kind of what I was taught. Like, just like, don't put them on your list. There's limited benefit from following up with them. You're just always going to hear the same thing. So this is a story that kind of supports your thesis that engaging people has added, if you're an economist, you'd say externalities, right? That go just beyond that relationship. Does that feel fair? It's a way to describe
exactly. And, so think about, in that example that I just shared, the the receiving spouse, let's say it's the widow, who
Mm-hmm.
doesn't respond to Michelle and who doesn't come to visit campus, but who is maybe talking about this wonderful thing that happened that her late husband's college did, and she happens to mention it to a relative or to a friend who has a son who's starting to consider college.
Okay.
And what is the message and what is the value that comes across in that story to the person who's hearing it? Is it possible that they think, wow, that's the kind of organization I think I want to know a little bit more about? And so, you can extend that out even
Okay.
further.
So engagement is not this wishy-washy feel-good thing. It has very definite positive effects, and you just like mentioned a very possible, believable sequence that would lead maybe to an enrolled student, right? It's
Yeah.
just it's very hard to measure. I mean, is that kind of the
Um,
issue? Why would people think that like this program that you were describing from Wabash, which is amazing, is kind of, over the top? What's the thought process there?
uh, so say that again. I'm
So
get to be
I'm
the
taking the
slow guy.
devil's advocate. I'm being the devil's
Yeah.
advocate here.
Yeah.
Why? So engagement has, lots of really good effects. They're just kind
Mhm.
of maybe second and third order effects, so they're harder to measure.
Yeah.
Um, and what do shops typically, and I'm trying to understand, from you, Ron, but from everybody who's here listening, right, is how do you justify doing these things internally? We have a limited amount of time, a limited amount of resources. How do people make, I'm just curious, generally, how do people make that case? And I kind of know the answer, Ron, for how we make the case and how we help teams make the case. But
Yeah. Yeah.
what you've seen in your career, how do they make this case for, hey, this is worth it? This is, I mean, it's important stuff.
Yeah. So, and I think that the case is made more around, it's almost extrapolatable, right? If you
Mhm.
took it in the opposite direction, so I'll redevil your devil, and looked at people who in your universe are the givers and are the consistent givers, and kind of trace your relationships away from the giving, I think you will find that many of those, especially let's call them the larger donors, but even consistent donors, you can sort of read the relationship thread and say, oh, they're with us because we've been in contact with them in ways that have mattered. And this is how the mattering has shown up. And in lots of cases, and here, my headset is um, always kind of predominantly on higher education because it's my background. But think about people who have shown up, who have come to reunions, who've been part of planning, who attend events in the field.
Mhm.
They're kind of doing that on their own in ways that are almost entirely up to them. I mean, the organization is inviting them to do those things, but the actual number of respondents is pretty small. And
Mhm.
so, how do you open that opportunity up in ways that you create more reasons for people to show up? And here's, an important consideration. Some of showing up you may not be able to see.
Mhm.
You made this comment a while ago, and I can't remember where it was, but it's something to the effect of, your community is happening all around you. You just may not
Yeah,
be aware of it all. And
totally.
that I think is a really important concept for, it's, and you posted about lurkers the other day. Those things are knitted together. And if, we can come to a place of assuming the best about people, that, lurkers are good, and that people who raise up our community without us knowing about it are good, and not, how come we don't
Mhm.
know about this? Why don't we have this information in our database? Don't get stuck there. Assume the best, be inviting, be welcoming, and I think then more of it will accrue. And we're seeing that in some of the work that we're doing.
Okay, and we see that, right, Ron? Especially, we ask a question when we help organizations survey their constituents about getting together in community-like ways with other people related to the institution, and we find that very often they're getting together in ways that are kind of outside of the advancement office.
Exactly, because we can tell, and we ask a question in a way that is inclusive of those sorts of contacts and communications, but is intentionally broader than that. And when an organization sees, oh my goodness, this person or this number of people is telling us they're having lots and lots of conversations about the place. Again, the instinct is to say, how do we not know about this? But then, if you think about it, well, you got two people who are connected to the organization who live in the same household, right? Spouses, parent, child, that sort of thing. And of course, they're going to be talking about it. And so what are you able to do, or how are you able to formulate approaches to people, just knowing that simple fact, right?
Okay, so we're about to get into the dough, which I feel is going to be important for some people. Like, where does the money show up? The title of the presentation had dollar signs.
I know.
But just to recap, we went through kind of your general perspective on these things, which I know I definitely share, and we work, with Jim Langley, and we know he shares too. So that there's a kind of a group of like-minded practitioners. And then we went into one specific example, which I felt was really good because it's not what you'd expect. Like, I'm sure that if I'm in higher ed and I start thinking about engagement, I'm going to think about a lecture, lecture series, or just kind of the typical places you'd go. And then you said to make this point, just look at your donors and look at the ones who have maybe given the most, and try to measure how loyal they've been, or what their engagement with you has been. And so I think this is a good point to go into our second. What was our second slide? But I'll just change the order.
Okay.
So let's do that. I'm going to put this on the screen for everybody. Okay.
And there it is.
There we go. So Ron, what do we tell people when we show their own data and we say, look, this is what this looks, but what does it mean?
So I'm going to explain what people are looking at here, and then maybe invite you to do more contextualizing, because we've actually talked about this a lot. So when we ask for this is information that's coming out of a survey process, but it's actually data that didn't require a survey to surface, right? This is information that sits in an institution's database. So we ask for, in this case, it was 11 years going back historically of giving data. So most recent to 11 years back, and year by year. And so we also ask, can you please tell us what the largest gift is that this constituent has ever made to the organization? Okay. So the 2 points on this chart are, the vertical is the ranges of the largest gift ever made to the organization. And the bars are showing the median number of consecutive years of giving that are attached to each of the highest gift ranges. So at the top, for the people whose largest gift is under $1,000, their median consecutive giving across this pool is 2 years, meaning, of course, that half the people in the pool have given more than 2 years, and half the people in the pool have given less than 2 years. And consecutively means a period of 2 consecutive years inside that window of 11, right? At the bottom, those last 2 bars where the highest gift ever made was over $50,000, the median number of years of consecutive giving is 11. So year over year over year over year, giving has a relationship to largest ever gifts. Over to you.
Well, I mean, I think that's essentially it. I'm going to maybe repeat some of the questions I get, which is, does this look the same for all the organizations that you look at? And I have to say, so far, yes. Does it look exactly the same, as in, why is my organization 6 at 1,000 and my, this other one was 4? So what looks the same is the direction of things. The details obviously change. You might have had programs, incentives for a particular gift level, a historical giving program that was very successful. So every organization will be different, but the overall trend is always, so far, pretty clear. Other questions that we've received. Well, does that mean that everybody who has given for 6 consecutive years will give $1,000? No. That that's not exactly it. First, it's a median, so it means that half the people are under and half are over. But as a trend, and as if you have to make a business decision based on things you don't know, this is it seems like a fairly good decision to make. And then obviously it depends on capacity. So the number of people giving $100,000 is much fewer than the number of people giving $11.
And we should point out that, not surprisingly, of a group of almost 10,000 constituents, the biggest group is the top bar, those who've given less than $1,000, and the smallest group is the one at the bottom. But we're going to unpack that a little bit on the next slide. And I think the other question, Louis, that comes out of this one is, what are the conditions that lead people to become these very consistent donors? Because, just kind of logically looking at this one, you want the bars to be longer in general, but also because you start to see the pattern that the more it is, the more consistency you have in the giving, the largest gift range tends to be.
Absolutely. And I think, Ron, that's maybe where we do get a little bit into the tactical, right? But I would say at a kind of strategic advancement wide level or development department wide level, it's a focus on things like donor relations, keeping people around through programming that they find valuable. So I almost feel like, hey, this isn't rocket science. It's a refocus of our investments.
Well, and again, going to McKinsey, how are organizations demonstrating credibility, reliability, and intimacy with people? Because those are ingredients that deliver the kind of results that you see at the lower bars here. And that, those are, I think, tactical places. How do we think about credibility and demonstrating it? How do we think about being reliable? Are we showing up as an organization when we say we're going to show up? Are we making statements that we can back up, that are credible? And are we reaching out to people in ways that they like to be reached out to? They feel respected. They feel valued.
Yeah. And this is where, like, in the heat of things, where when you're in that executive team meeting, and you're discussing maybe postponing that annual report or not doing something that you said you would. That's where I always feel that this counterbalance would be helpful to have there as a voice. Well, yes, that can work for us in a certain number of ways, but in other ways, it's going to hurt us.
Yeah.
So let's go to slide number 2, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. This is the one we're most
Okay.
excited about.
So this is the culmination of our call today with everybody that's here joining us. We'd love to answer
Thank you.
questions.
Thank you
So
for staying with us.
yeah, exactly. To the brave souls who were able to make the platform change. If you do have a question, or some of this sounds interesting, or some of it sounds unrealistic, we want to hear from you. So please feel free to
Yeah.
chat in, and we'll cover it as we go. Ron, I'll leave this up to you to explain what it is that we're looking at and what
Yeah.
conclusions you make out of this.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, just to set up the data here, we're looking at a pool of about 9,000 people. And you can see in the white bars how those 9,000 are distributed. So 85%, 85.16% have made a largest gift to this organization of under $1,000. And then at the other end, 0.5%, which would be what, about 45, 44 people, have made a largest gift of over $100,000. The blue bars are where this gets interesting because now we're introducing questions that we asked in the survey. And in the blue bars are those respondents who told us that they met or discussed the organization at least 5 times in the past 12 months, and they always or very often feel valued in those conversations that they have concerning the organization. And you can see the number of those is 404. So about, help me on the math here, is that 5%-ish of the total pool. Okay.
Like.
So what's interesting, and you can see that the skew on these bars moves more to the right. And beyond the first pair, let's look at the largest donors of $1,000 to $2,500. So 6.3% of the overall pool is in that group, but 8.66% of those who feel valued and talk about the place a lot are in that group. So it's about 1.2 times more than the overall body. And then we move over to the next set of bars. A little over 4.5% of the overall pool has a largest gift of $2,500 to $10,000 versus over almost 9.5% of the meet a lot, talk a lot, feel valued a lot part of the pool. So that's a 2 times representation. And you can keep tracing that all the way over to the smallest group at the right, where compared to 0.5% of the overall pool, 2.5% or 5 times the population, the percentage is showing up there. And so I know you and I have started throwing this around as the X factor, 1.2x, 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x. And so, I kind of go back to where we started in how is it that engagement delivers frequency of conversation, frequency of meeting, and a feeling of being valued, because what we're drawing from what people are looking at here is the more you can do it, the odds are that you're going to be able to move people in ways that maximize their giving capacity.
And Ron, you and I were having fun with a back of the napkin calculation, right?
Yeah, why don't you run through that one?
Yeah. Okay. So this is kind of just for fun. Remember, it's not a modeling, it's not a prediction, but it definitely gives a lot of food for thought. If we focus on that 2,500 to 9,999 group, the third range there, you see that there's a difference of about 4.5% more. So it's double. And what would that kind of got us thinking. So imagine if you had 9.41% of the total pool of all your donors, if all of them met 5 times and always or very often felt valued, meet a lot, talk a lot, feel valued a lot, like Ron is saying. So if you imagine that, so, you know, let's say you add 4.5% of that almost 9,000 people pool. I just calculated that on my desktop. That's 403 people. That would be 403 people giving at a minimum $2,500. And for those who are more math oriented, you will already know the answer, but that's over $1 million. Not to say in year one, it's a lifetime gift, but that's just a small sliver of potential revenue increase right there. If, you know, if you went down and you modeled that, the numbers would look even larger. And that's kind of, you know, how we're trying to cross that bridge, right, Ron? Because you started talking a lot about values, kind of institutional values. I'm going to take off the screen share so we can see each other. But that's our attempt to show this in a way that perhaps is easier to understand, but just knowing that the positive effects go, you know, much beyond that.
Well, and you know, I hate to sound like a broken record, but your McKinsey trust calculus is so valuable. And so, you know, we've talked a lot about organizations that will reach out for surveys like the one that we just, you know, put up here, and will not report back out to the people who completed the survey, much less the ones who were invited to complete the survey and who may not have, for reasons that, you know, aren't nefarious. They just, you know, they're living life and they missed it. But if it's important enough that we reached out to somebody to ask some questions, is it not also important to report back, here's what we learned, and we want to share that with you? And that deepens engagement and accountability and takes responsibility in ways that, you know, it's so easy. And yet, you know, a lot of places tend to sort of scoop up the data and not report it back out. And, you know, you can apply that across lots of activity areas in advancement where, you know, if you ask somebody to do something and they do it, how are you acknowledging it? How are you reporting back on it? If, you know, sometimes it may not be appropriate to think about there's a report. You know, going back to morbidity for a moment. And again, you know, here, let's think instead about, you know, long-serving employees of organizations will often retire, and there's a fundraising, you know, effort that comes together, and lots of people may make gifts, but how often do we say back to the donors, hey, you were part of something that generated this much bigger amount, and here's how we plan to use it in order to honor the individual that you chose to help honor. That simple kind of step will create benefits that, you know, it's a couple of people, Sean, and I can't remember the name of the woman who asked you know, how do we make the case for this? And that the engagement is going to deliver back dollars. Well, I don't know that you can, but I don't know that you can make the case that so many people who gave $100 last year are going to give $200 this year just because they gave $100 last year. And so, you know, some of it you have to kind of convince yourself and then convince others that these are conversations worth having, in part because you see a revenue or value benefit, but again, in part because it's just the right thing to do. And organizations need to be trusted and have people who are confident in them in order to feel like they want to invest.
Yeah, I love this. And, you know, also thinking of how this is really not different from what we're doing, in the sense of we typically do a pretty amazing job of this with our board or major gift donors. There's a lot of accountability. It's just maybe, societally we've changed, but the expectation for people to trust us has kind of, been pushed down that donor pyramid. People want and
Yeah.
expect this. Significantly, and we see that a lot. Well, Ron, I don't know if you have any parting words. I know at the beginning we had kind of maybe discussed starting with something, if you want to do that, or just invite people to connect with you. I know Ron is very helpful on LinkedIn for sure. How would you like to close today?
Well, you're kind for letting me go there. Some people who may be on this call know that I grew up in a place called Highland Park, Illinois, and a week ago, that was the site of a pretty tragic event, and people are hurting there. I've talked to a lot of people there in the last week, and if anyone is inclined to want to be helpful, an organization called the Highland Park Community Foundation is out there. They are at hpcfil.org, and on that site, there's a place to contribute and a note that says all contributions to the response fund will go directly to victims and survivors or the organizations that support them. So please consider that. And thank you, Louis, for your partnership and for the great work that you're doing. And even though we had a rocky start here this morning, I appreciate that we slogged through it and we've reached the end and we did it on time. And if there are any questions, yeah, we'll be happy to answer them here or on LinkedIn.
That's absolutely wonderful. Well, thank you, Ron. I hope to continue this joint mission that we have to prove the value, or maybe to open maybe some people's eyes to the benefits of this kind of more value-oriented, value-first approach, trust-first approach. It does mean a lot to me. Thanks, everybody. And remember, if you like this type of conversations, if you think it's valuable to you, join dpp.org is how you get plugged into more of them. We'll catch up with you next time. Thanks a lot.